After my grandfather's funeral, I was called by a lawyer to receive an unexpected inheritance. I sat in the sterile waiting room of Henderson and Associates, still wearing the black dress from the service, still tasting the bitter coffee from the church reception. Grandpa Henry had been 92 when he passed, peacefully in his sleep, they said, but his death had left a hollow ache in my chest that felt like it might never heal. Miss Naomi Fletcher? The secretary's voice startled me from my grief-fogged thoughts. Mr. Henderson will see you now. I followed her down a hallway lined with mahogany and leather-bound law books, wondering why my grandfather had left me anything at all. We'd been close when I was young, but the past decade had strained our relationship. Family tensions, old arguments about things I could barely remember now. I'd assumed everything would go to my father or my Aunt Margaret, the responsible adults who'd maintained contact with him through his final years. Mr. Henderson was a thin man with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses. He gestured for me to sit across from his massive desk, which was covered with neat stacks of documents. I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Fletcher. Your grandfather was a remarkable man. He opened a file folder. Now, regarding his final wishes. Henry Fletcher left very specific instructions about this particular bequest. I don't understand. I thought everything was going to Dad and Margaret. The majority of the estate, yes. But there was one item he specifically wanted you to have. Henderson reached into his desk drawer and withdrew a manila envelope. He said to give this to you exactly 7 days after his funeral. With his exact words, tell Naomi that some truths are worth more than money, and some secrets are worth dying for. My hands trembled as I accepted the envelope. It was heavier than expected, and I could feel something rigid inside. Not documents, but something else. Did he say anything else? Only that you'd understand when you saw it. And that if anything happened to him before natural causes, you should take this to the police immediately. A chill ran down my spine. What do you mean if anything happened to him? Henderson shifted uncomfortably. Your grandfather came to me 6 months ago, quite agitated. He said he'd discovered something about your family's past, something dangerous. He wouldn't elaborate, but he insisted on creating this specific bequest for you. I stared at the envelope, afraid to open it. Why me? Why not my father or Margaret? He said you were the only one he could trust, the only one not already compromised by family loyalty. The words sent ice through my veins. I thanked Henderson and drove home in a daze, the envelope sitting beside me like a ticking bomb. My small apartment felt different when I entered. Too quiet, too empty. I made tea with shaking hands and sat at my kitchen table, staring at my grandfather's final gift. Inside the envelope was a single photograph, old and yellowed with age. It showed a group of 8 people standing in front of what looked like a lake house. Men, women, and children in 1970s clothing, all smiling broadly at the camera. The colors had faded to sepia tones, and several faces were difficult to make out clearly. But in the bottom right corner, written in my grandfather's distinctive handwriting, were words that made my blood freeze. The killer is in this photo. Below that, in smaller text, Naomi, Emma Hartwell didn't run away. Find the truth. Trust no one in the family. Grandpa Henry, Emma Hartwell. The name meant nothing to me, but something about it felt familiar, like a half-remembered nightmare. I turned the photograph over and found more of my grandfather's writing. Summer 1975, Lake Minnetonka, 3 days before Emma disappeared forever. I studied the faces in the photograph more carefully. There was my grandfather as a much younger man, maybe in his 40s, standing beside a woman I didn't recognize. Next to them was a couple I thought might be my great-aunt and uncle, though it was hard to be sure. Several children were scattered throughout the group, teenagers and younger kids, all grinning at something outside the frame. One face caught my attention immediately. A young man, maybe 17 or 18, standing slightly apart from the others. Unlike everyone else in the photo, his smile seemed forced, and his eyes held something that looked like fear or guilt. There was something familiar about his features, but I couldn't place where I might have seen them before. I grabbed my laptop and searched for Emma Hartwell missing 1975. The results made my stomach drop. Emma Marie Hartwell, age 16, had disappeared from Lake Minnetonka, Minnesota in July 1975. She was last seen leaving a family reunion, telling relatives she was going for a walk along the lakeshore. Her body was never found. Police had investigated for months, interviewing dozens of family members and friends, but no arrests were ever made. The case had gone cold decades ago. According to the news articles I found, Emma had been staying with relatives for the summer, relatives whose names I recognized with growing horror. The Hartwell family had been connected by marriage to the Fletchers. Emma had been at our family reunion when she vanished. My grandfather believed someone in our family had killed her. I looked at the photograph again, studying each smiling face with new eyes. One of these people, maybe someone I'd grown up calling uncle or aunt, maybe someone who'd bounced me on their knee as a child, was a murderer. My phone rang, startling me so badly I nearly dropped the photo. The caller ID showed my father's number. Naomi, I just talked to Margaret. She said you had a meeting with Grandpa's lawyer today. What did he leave you? The question sounded casual, but there was an undercurrent of tension in his voice that made me hesitate. I looked at the photograph again, at my grandfather's warning to trust no one in the family. Just some old papers, I lied. Nothing important. Oh, well, if there's anything valuable, you know the family would want to. Dad, I have to go. I'll call you later. I hung up and immediately regretted it. My father would know I was hiding something now, but as I stared at the faces in the photograph, I realized I didn't know which of my relatives I could trust. For the first time since my grandfather's death, I felt truly alone. And somewhere in the back of my mind, a terrible thought was forming. What if my grandfather's natural death hadn't been natural at all? I spent the entire night examining the photograph under every light in my apartment, using a magnifying glass to study details I'd missed before. By dawn, I'd identified most of the people in the picture, and the realization made my blood run cold. These weren't distant relatives or family friends. These were the people who'd been part of my life since childhood. The woman standing next to my grandfather was definitely my great-aunt Dorothy, though she looked 40 years younger than when I'd last seen her. Beside her was Uncle Frank, my father's older brother, wearing a fishing vest and that same easy smile I remembered from a dozen family barbecues. The children scattered throughout the photo included my father as a teenager, Aunt Margaret looking sullen at about 15, and several cousins I could now identify despite the decades that had passed. But it was the young man standing apart from the group who troubled me most. I'd spent hours studying his face, certain I'd seen those features before. The high cheekbones, the deep-set eyes, the way he held his left shoulder slightly higher than his right. It all seemed familiar. Then it hit me. I grabbed a recent family photo from my bookshelf, one taken at last year's Christmas dinner. There, seated at the far end of the table with his wife and grown children, was Uncle Marcus, Aunt Margaret's husband of 35 years, the man who'd taught me to fish and helped me with math homework throughout middle school. The resemblance was unmistakable. The young man in the 1975 photograph was Marcus, though the last name would have been different then. He'd taken Margaret's name when they married, claiming it was more progressive that way. Uncle Marcus had been at Lake Minnetonka when Emma Hartwell disappeared. I made coffee with trembling hands and started researching Marcus Webb, his name before he married into our family. What I found made my stomach turn. Marcus had grown up in foster care after his parents died in a car accident when he was 12. He'd been in and out of trouble as a teenager. Petty theft, vandalism, one arrest for assault that was dropped when the victim refused to testify. By 16, he'd been living with distant relatives in Minnesota, the same relatives who'd invited him to the 1975 Fletcher family reunion where he'd met my aunt. The timeline fit perfectly. Emma had disappeared 3 days after the photo was taken. Marcus had been there, had access to the lake, and had a history of violence. But why would my grandfather wait 47 years to reveal this suspicion? And why trust me of all people with the truth? My phone buzzed with a text from Aunt Margaret. Dad mentioned you got something from Grandpa's lawyer. Want to come over for lunch? Marcus is making his famous chili. The invitation felt ominous now. I stared at Marcus's name on my phone screen, remembering all the times he'd been kind to me, all the family gatherings where he'd been the funny uncle who told jokes and fixed broken toys. Could someone who'd been part of my family for over 3 decades really be a killer? I drove to Margaret's house in a daze, the photograph hidden in my purse like a loaded weapon. Their home was a sprawling ranch in the suburbs, the kind of place that screamed middle-class respectability. Margaret had always been the responsible one, the family organizer who remembered birthdays and planned reunions. Marcus answered the door with flour on his hands, and that same warm smile I'd known my entire life. Naomi, perfect timing, just pulled cornbread out of the oven. He hugged me, and I found myself studying his hands. Large, strong enough to overpower a 16-year-old girl. Margaret's in the garden. Go say hello while I finish lunch. I walked through their immaculate house, looking for signs of the darkness I now suspected. But everything was normal. Family photos on the mantel, Margaret's quilting supplies scattered across the dining room table, the comfortable clutter of a long, stable marriage. Margaret was kneeling in her vegetable garden, pulling weeds with focused intensity. She looked up as I approached, and I was struck by how much she'd aged since our last visit. Her hair was completely gray now, and there were new lines around her eyes. Naomi, sweetheart, I'm so glad you came. She stood and brushed dirt from her knees. These past few weeks have been so difficult. Losing Dad, dealing with all the estate paperwork. I can imagine. Your father mentioned you had a meeting with the lawyer yesterday. I hope it wasn't anything complicated. The question sounded innocent, but there was something in her eyes, a sharpness that hadn't been there before. Just some family documents, I said carefully. Nothing important. Oh, she paused, studying my face. It's just that Dad had been acting so strangely these past months, asking questions about old times, digging through photo albums, making odd comments about the past. We were worried he might have been getting confused. What kind of questions? Margaret glanced toward the house, making sure we were alone. He kept asking about that summer at Lake Minnetonka back in '75. Do you remember that trip? You were too young, of course, but it was right before your father started college. We rented this big house on the lake for a week. My pulse quickened. What about it? There was a girl who went missing that week. A distant cousin or something. Emma, somebody. The police questioned everyone, but nothing ever came of it. Dad seemed obsessed with it lately, like he thought he'd forgotten some important detail. Did he say what kind of detail? No, but... Margaret lowered her voice. He'd been asking strange questions about Marcus, about how we met, about his life before he joined our family. It was almost like he suspected Marcus of something. The words hung in the air between us. I could hear Marcus moving around in the kitchen, humming an old song while he cooked. That seems unlikely, I managed. That's what I told him. Marcus has been nothing but devoted to this family for 35 years. He's been a wonderful husband, a great father to our children. The idea that he could hurt anyone. She shook her head. But Dad seemed convinced that someone in the family knew more about that girl's disappearance than they were saying. We were interrupted by Marcus calling from the house. Ladies, lunch is ready. As we walked back toward the kitchen, Margaret put her hand on my arm. Naomi, if Grandpa left you anything related to that old business, any papers or photos or whatever, I think you should let the family see them. We need to stick together, especially now that Dad's gone. The pressure in her grip was just a little too firm, and her smile was just a little too forced. For the first time in my life, I felt afraid of my aunt. At lunch, I watched Marcus carefully while he served chili and cornbread, noting how he moved, how he spoke, how he interacted with Margaret. He seemed genuinely affectionate with her, and his stories about their early years together had the ring of truth. But I also noticed how he changed the subject whenever the conversation moved toward family history, and how his eyes went flat when Margaret mentioned my grandfather's recent questions. Poor Henry, Marcus said, shaking his head. Getting old is tough. Mind starts playing tricks on you, making you suspicious of the people who love you most. Did he ever talk to you directly about his concerns? I asked. Marcus paused with his spoon halfway to his mouth, once or twice. Nothing specific, just rambling about old times. I tried to reassure him, but you know how stubborn he could be. What kind of reassurance? Just that the past was the past, and some things were better left buried. Marcus met my eyes across the table. Don't you think so, Naomi? Some secrets are just too painful to dig up. The words echoed my grandfather's message about secrets being worth dying for, and I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. As I prepared to leave, Margaret walked me to my car. Promise me you'll be careful, she said. I know this sounds paranoid, but ever since Dad died, I've had this feeling that someone's been watching the house. Probably nothing, but what kind of watching? Cars that don't belong in the neighborhood, phone calls where no one speaks. Maybe it's just grief making me imagine things. Or maybe, I thought as I drove home, it was guilt. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Emma Hartwell's face from the missing person photos I'd found online. A pretty 16-year-old with dark hair and trusting eyes who'd vanished without a trace. I kept thinking about Margaret's words. Some secrets are just too painful to dig up. By morning, I'd made a decision. I was going to Minnesota. The drive to Lake Minnetonka took 6 hours, giving me plenty of time to think about what I was doing. My grandfather had waited 47 years to reveal his suspicions about Emma's death. Why now? What had changed in the months before his death that made him finally decide to act? The lake house from the photograph was easy to find. It was still there, now painted a different color but otherwise unchanged. I parked across the street and stared at the building where my family had vacationed that fateful summer, trying to imagine what had happened here in July 1975. The local library had archived newspaper coverage of Emma's disappearance. I spent hours reading through yellowed clippings, taking notes on every detail. Emma had been staying with her great-aunt Martha Hartwell, who'd invited her for a summer away from her troubled home life in Chicago. The Fletcher family reunion had been held at a rented lake house just 3 doors down from where Martha lived. Emma had attended the reunion as Martha's guest. She was distantly related to the Fletchers through marriage. Multiple witnesses saw her there throughout the day, playing games with the younger children, helping with food preparation, chatting with the teenagers. She'd seemed happy, relaxed, enjoying her summer freedom. But according to the police reports, Emma had been acting strangely in the days following the reunion. Martha Hartwell told investigators that her great-niece had become withdrawn, nervous, jumping at unexpected sounds. When asked what was wrong, Emma had only said she'd seen something she shouldn't have seen. 3 days after the photograph was taken, Emma told Martha she was going for a walk along the lake shore. She never returned. The investigation had been thorough, but ultimately fruitless. Police interviewed everyone who'd been at the reunion. including my teenage father, aunt, and Uncle Marcus. All had alibis for the time of Emma's disappearance, and none had shown signs of deception or guilt. But I noticed something in the police files that made me pause. Uncle Marcus had been interviewed 3 separate times, more than any other family member. The detective's notes indicated some inconsistencies in his story about his whereabouts on the day Emma vanished. I found Martha Hartwell's address in an old phone book. She'd be in her 90s now if she was still alive. The Shady Oaks nursing home was a depressing building that smelled of disinfectant and despair. Martha Hartwell was indeed still alive, though her mind came and went like tide pools. Some days she was sharp as a tack, the staff told me. Other days she didn't recognize her own reflection. I was lucky. Today was a good day. Emma? The elderly woman's eyes lit up when I mentioned the name. My beautiful Emma. They told me she ran away, but I knew better. She wasn't the running type. What do you think happened to her, Mrs. Hartwell? Martha leaned closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. She saw something at that family gathering, something that scared her. She tried to tell me, but I was too busy, too distracted. I should have listened. What kind of something? She said she'd gone looking for the bathroom and got lost in the house. Ended up downstairs near the basement. That's when she saw them. Saw who? 2 people, a man and a woman. They were arguing about something terrible. Martha's eyes grew distant. Emma said the woman was crying, begging, and the man was so angry, so cold. Emma hid and listened, and what she heard, what did she hear? Plans. They were planning to hurt someone, to kill someone. Martha grabbed my hand with surprising strength. Emma was terrified they'd seen her, that they knew she'd overheard. She wanted to go to the police, but I told her to wait, to be sure. I thought maybe she'd misunderstood. My heart was racing. Did she describe the people she saw? The woman was older, maybe 40s, dark hair, crying like her heart was breaking. Martha paused, concentrating. The man was younger. Strange thing was, Emma said he wasn't family. She'd never seen him before that weekend. Not family? But he was in the photograph with everyone else. Maybe he was visiting someone. A boyfriend, perhaps. Martha's grip on my hand tightened. Emma said he had scary eyes. Cold eyes. Like he didn't care about anything or anyone. I thought about the young man in the photograph, Marcus, and his forced smile. But Martha's description didn't quite fit. Marcus had been part of the family by then, dating Margaret. He wouldn't have been unknown to Emma. Mrs. Hartwell, do you still have any of Emma's belongings? Letters? A diary? Anything from that summer? Oh yes, I kept everything, hoping she'd come back for it. Martha smiled sadly. The police went through it all, but they didn't find anything useful. It's in storage now, at my daughter's house. She gave me her daughter's contact information, and I called immediately. Carol Hartwell Jensen was suspicious at first, but when I explained about my grandfather's photograph and his dying message, she agreed to let me look through Emma's things. Carol's house was in a Minneapolis suburb, and Emma's belongings were stored in clear plastic boxes in the basement. Clothes from 1975, teenage jewelry, books, and school papers. At the bottom of one box, I found what I was looking for. A diary with a small brass lock. The lock had been broken long ago, probably by police investigators, but the diary was still there. I opened it to the entries from July 1975. Emma's handwriting was round and careful, the script of a girl who'd been taught proper penmanship. The early entries from her summer at Lake Minnetonka were cheerful, full of descriptions of swimming and sunbathing and helping her great aunt with household chores. But the entry dated 3 days after the Fletcher family reunion made my blood run cold. July 18th, 1975. I can't stop shaking. I can't sleep. I keep thinking about what I saw and heard today, and I don't know what to do. I was looking for a bathroom during the party and went into the wrong part of the house. There was a door that looked like it might lead to a powder room, but it was actually stairs to the basement. I started to go back up, but then I heard voices arguing below. I shouldn't have listened, but they were being so loud, and the woman sounded so upset. I crept down a few steps so I could hear better. It was Mrs. Fletcher and that young man who's dating her daughter. They were talking about someone named David, who'd been asking questions about something that happened years ago. The man said David was getting too close, that he needed to be dealt with permanently. Mrs. Fletcher was crying and saying she couldn't live with any more blood on her hands. But the man said it was too late to grow a conscience now, that they'd gone too far to back out. Then he said something that made my stomach turn. We buried the other one, and no one ever found him. We can do it again. I ran back upstairs as quietly as I could, but I think they might have heard me. The man kept looking at me strangely for the rest of the day. Great Aunt Martha thinks I'm being dramatic, but I'm scared. What if they know I overheard them? What if they think I'll tell someone? I don't even know who David is, but I think he's in danger. I think they're planning to kill him. The diary entry ended there. The next page was blank, and there were no more entries after July 18th. Emma had overheard a murder plot, but it wasn't Marcus she'd seen in the basement. It was someone else, someone who'd been planning to kill a man named David, and apparently, they'd killed before. I photographed every page of the diary and drove back to Lake Minnetonka as the sun was setting. The lake house looked different in the evening light, darker, more ominous. I parked in the same spot as before and called the number Martha had given me for Emma's cousin, David. It went straight to voicemail. As I sat in my car, staring at the house where a 16-year-old girl had overheard plans for murder, my phone rang. The caller ID showed my father's number. "Naomi, where are you? I've been calling all day." "I'm out of town for work," I lied. "Margaret said you seemed upset yesterday. She's worried about you." There was a pause. "We all are. Ever since Grandpa's funeral, you've been acting strange." "I'm fine, Dad. Are you sure? Because if there's something bothering you, something about the family maybe, you know you can talk to me, right?" The question felt loaded with meaning. I thought about Emma's diary, about the woman crying in the basement, about murder plans and buried bodies. "Actually, Dad, I've been thinking about that summer at Lake Minnetonka, when you were a teenager. Do you remember it?" The silence stretched so long I thought the call had dropped. "Dad, why are you asking about that?" His voice had changed, become cautious. "No reason. Just curious about family history. Some family history is better left alone, Naomi. Some things are too painful to dig up." The exact same words Marcus had used the day before. As I drove home in the darkness, I realized that everyone in my family was using the same script, warning me away from the same secrets, and I was beginning to understand why Emma Hartwell had never made it home from her walk by the lake. I couldn't go home that night. Instead, I checked into a motel near Lake Minnetonka and spread Emma's diary photos across the scratched wooden desk, reading each entry by lamplight. The girl's fear was palpable, even 47 years later, her careful handwriting growing shakier as she described the conversation she'd overheard. But it was the reference to the other one they'd buried that haunted me most. Emma had stumbled onto evidence of not just one planned murder, but a pattern of killing that stretched back years before 1975. At dawn, I drove to the local newspaper office. The Minnetonka Herald had been documenting local news since 1923, and their archives were surprisingly well organized. I started with missing persons reports from the early 1970s, looking for anyone named David. I found him on the third roll of microfilm. David Patrick Morrison, age 34, had disappeared in June 1974, exactly 1 year before Emma Hartwell. He'd been a private investigator from Minneapolis, hired by a wealthy family to look into insurance fraud. According to the newspaper report, Morrison had been investigating suspicious deaths and disappearances dating back to the 1960s, following a pattern of families who'd collected substantial life insurance payouts after accidental deaths. The last person known to have spoken with Morrison was his secretary, who said he'd been excited about a breakthrough in his case. He'd told her he was driving to Lake Minnetonka to interview a family connected to several of the suspicious deaths. He never came back. Police had investigated, but Morrison's car was never found, and there were no leads. The case had gone cold within months, but the family he'd been coming to interview was named in the police report, the Fletcher family. My hands trembled as I read the details. Morrison had been tracking a pattern of deaths connected to my family going back 15 years. Drownings, car accidents, house fires, all involving people who'd had conflicts with various Fletcher family members, and all resulting in insurance payouts or inheritance windfalls. The investigator had believed someone in my family was systematically murdering people for financial gain. I printed every article I could find about Morrison's disappearance, then drove to the Minneapolis Police Department. The case files were archived, but a sympathetic detective named Sarah Chen helped me access them. Morrison was a good investigator, Detective Chen told me, pulling boxes of yellowed files from storage. Very thorough, very careful. If he thought he'd found evidence of serial murder, he probably had. The files painted a disturbing picture. Morrison had documented 12 suspicious deaths between 1959 and 1974, all connected to the Fletcher family network. The victims included a business partner who discovered my great-uncle Frank's embezzlement, a neighbor who'd threatened to report great-aunt Dorothy for insurance fraud, and a former employee who'd accused my grandfather of tax evasion. Each death had been ruled accidental or natural causes. Each death had financially benefited a Fletcher family member. And according to Morrison's notes, he'd identified the person he believed was responsible for orchestrating the murders. My grandfather, Henry Fletcher. "This doesn't make sense," I told Detective Chen. "My grandfather was the one who left me the photograph, who wanted the truth about Emma's murder to come out. Why would he expose a killer if he was the killer? Maybe guilt finally caught up with him," she suggested. "Or maybe someone else took over the operation and he wanted to stop them." I thought about Emma's diary entry, about the crying woman in the basement, Mrs. Fletcher. But which Mrs. Fletcher? My grandmother had died when I was 10. Had it been her in the basement or someone else? That evening, I called Great Aunt Dorothy from my motel room. At 87, she was the oldest surviving member of my grandfather's generation, and if anyone knew the family's darkest secrets, it would be her. "Naomi, dear, how lovely to hear from you." Her voice was as sharp as I remembered, despite her advanced age. "Though I must say, your timing is curious. I've been getting calls from family members all week, everyone asking about old photographs and family history." "What kind of questions?" "Oh, the same sort your grandfather was asking before he died. Ancient history about that summer at Lake Minnetonka, about people who used to be part of the family but aren't anymore." Dorothy paused. "People like Emma Hartwell." "You remember Emma?" "Of course I remember her. Sweet girl, very curious about everything. Too curious, perhaps." There was something in Dorothy's tone that made me grip the phone tighter. She had a habit of wandering around where she didn't belong, listening to conversations that weren't meant for her ears. "Aunt Dorothy, do you think Emma really ran away?" The silence stretched so long I thought she'd hung up. "No," Dorothy finally whispered. "No, I don't think she ran away. And I don't think Henry's death was natural causes either." My heart started pounding. "What do you mean?" "Your grandfather had been asking too many questions, just like that private investigator years ago, just like Emma. People who ask too many questions about Fletcher family business have a tendency to disappear." "Are you saying someone in our family is killing people?" "I'm saying there have been a lot of convenient deaths over the years, and a lot of convenient inheritances. And I'm saying that after Henry started digging into the past, he became very afraid of someone close to him." "Who?" "He wouldn't tell me directly, but he did say something that chilled me to the bone. He said the person he suspected had been right under our noses for decades. Someone we all trusted. Someone who'd married into the family specifically to have access to our secrets and our money. Someone who'd married into the family. Like Marcus, who'd taken Margaret's name and become one of us." "Aunt Dorothy, I need to ask you about Uncle Marcus, about how he and Margaret met, about his background." "Oh, darling." Dorothy's voice suddenly changed, became cautious. "I can't discuss that over the phone. Too risky. But if you really want to know the truth about your family, come see me tomorrow. I'll tell you everything I know about the Fletcher family murders." She gave me her address and hung up. I sat in the motel room, staring at the phone, wondering if I was making a terrible mistake. But I had to know. Emma Hartwell deserved justice, and if my grandfather had died because he'd discovered the truth, then I owed it to him to finish what he'd started. I fell asleep clutching the photograph, studying the faces of my family members, trying to see past their smiles to the darkness underneath. In my dreams, I heard Emma Hartwell calling for help from the bottom of a lake, but when I tried to reach her, the faces in the photograph came alive and dragged me down into the dark water with her. Great Aunt Dorothy lived in a rambling Victorian house on the outskirts of town, surrounded by overgrown gardens and shadowed by ancient oak trees. As I approached the front door the next morning, I noticed that several windows on the upper floors had been boarded up, giving the house an abandoned, haunted appearance. Dorothy answered the door before I could knock, as if she'd been watching for me. She was smaller and more frail than I remembered, her white hair thin and wispy, but her eyes were still sharp and alert. "Come in quickly," she said, glancing nervously over my shoulder, "and lock the door behind you." The interior of the house was dimly lit and cluttered with decades of accumulated possessions. Books and newspapers were stacked everywhere, and the air smelled of lavender and old secrets. "Tea?" Dorothy asked, leading me into a sitting room where heavy curtains blocked most of the natural light. "Thank you." I settled into a worn armchair, while she bustled around with the tea service, noting how her hands shook slightly as she poured. "Now then," she said, settling across from me with her own cup. "You want to know about the Fletcher family murders." "Murders, plural?" "Oh yes. There have been many over the years. Your grandfather Henry documented most of them, though he never had proof, just patterns, coincidences, and a growing certainty that someone in our family was very good at making inconvenient people disappear." Dorothy reached into a drawer and pulled out a worn notebook filled with her spidery handwriting. "After Henry died, I started my own investigation. I've been tracking every suspicious death connected to our family going back to 1958. She opened the notebook and showed me page after page of names, dates, and circumstances. The list was staggering. 17 people over 5 decades, all of whom had died under questionable circumstances after coming into conflict with Fletcher family members. "The pattern is always the same," Dorothy explained. "Someone discovers evidence of fraud, blackmail, theft, or another crime committed by a family member. That person threatens exposure or legal action. Within weeks or months, they die in what appears to be an accident or natural causes. But how is that possible? How could so many deaths be covered up? Because the killer is very careful, very patient, and very good at making murder look like misfortune." Dorothy turned to a page filled with medical terminology. Heart attacks induced by untraceable poisons. Car accidents caused by mechanical sabotage. Drowning staged to look accidental. House fires started with delayed ignition devices. I thought about my grandfather's sudden death in his sleep, supposedly from natural causes. Do you think Grandpa Henry was murdered? I'm certain of it. In his final weeks, he was getting close to identifying our family killer. He'd narrowed it down to 3 suspects, all people who'd had access to inside information about family finances and personal conflicts for decades. Who were the suspects? Dorothy leaned forward, lowering her voice to a whisper. Your Uncle Marcus was one, certainly. He appeared in our family at exactly the right time, and his background was always suspiciously vague. But there were 2 others. Henry suspected even more. Who? Your father, Thomas, and your Aunt Margaret. The words hit me like a physical blow. That's impossible. My father wouldn't hurt anyone. Your father has had financial problems for years, and several of the suspicious deaths resulted in inheritances or insurance payouts that benefited him directly. Dorothy showed me a page of calculations. Over the past 30 years, Thomas Fletcher has received approximately $2 million from deaths that Henry believed were murders. But Margaret, she's always been the responsible one, the family caretaker, which would make her the perfect killer. Who would suspect sweet Margaret, who organizes family reunions and sends birthday cards and visits elderly relatives? Dorothy's eyes were cold. Think about it, Naomi. Margaret has had access to everyone's personal information for decades. She knows everyone's medical conditions, financial problems, relationship conflicts. She'd know exactly when and how to strike. I tried to process this information, but it felt like my entire understanding of my family was collapsing. What about Emma Hartwell's diary? She described seeing Mrs. Fletcher arguing with a young man about killing someone named David, the private investigator who disappeared in 1974. And yes, that would fit Margaret's timeline perfectly. She would have been in her 20s then, old enough to be involved in the family business, but young enough to be influenced by someone older. Well, someone like Marcus, or someone like your grandfather. Dorothy closed the notebook. That's what makes this so complicated, Naomi. Henry left you that photograph to expose the killer. But what if Henry was the original killer, and someone else took over the operation after he got too old to continue? The possibility made my stomach turn. My grandfather as the architect of 5 decades of murder, training a successor to carry on his work. But then, why expose the truth now? There's something else, Dorothy continued. Something that connects to your inheritance directly. 3 weeks before Henry died, he told me he'd discovered who killed Emma Hartwell, and why she had to die. What did he say? That Emma had seen the killer's face during that conversation in the basement. That she could have identified them if she'd lived long enough to talk to police. Dorothy met my eyes. And that the person who killed Emma was still alive, still part of the family, and had recently started killing again. I thought about the timing of my grandfather's death, about the family members who'd been asking questions about old photographs and family history. Aunt Dorothy, have you told anyone else about these suspicions? About the notebook or the investigation? No, I haven't. She stopped mid-sentence, her face going pale. Oh no. Oh, Naomi, I think I've made a terrible mistake. What do you mean? Yesterday after you called, I got another phone call. Someone asking about family history, about that summer at Lake Minnetonka. I was so excited to finally have someone to share the truth with that I may have said too much. My blood turned to ice. Who called you? I thought it was you calling back. The voice sounded different, but I assumed it was a bad connection. Dorothy's hands were shaking violently now. I told them about Henry's investigation, about the notebook, about how we'd discovered the pattern of murders. Dorothy, who did you think you were talking to? They said they were calling on your behalf. They said you'd asked them to get more information about Emma Hartwell's death. She looked at me with growing horror. But it wasn't you, was it? Before I could answer, we heard the sound of a car pulling into the driveway. Dorothy went to the window and peered through the curtains, then stumbled backward as if she'd been struck. They're here, she whispered. Oh God, they're here. Who's here? I can see them through the window. 2 people getting out of a car. Dorothy grabbed my arm. Naomi, you have to get out of here. Now, take the notebook and run. I looked out the window and saw a familiar sedan parked in the driveway. My father and Aunt Margaret were walking toward the front door, their faces grim with purpose. But their family, they're killers, Dorothy hissed, pushing the notebook into my hands. And they're here to make sure we never tell anyone what we know. The front doorbell rang, echoing through the old house like a death knell. Dorothy looked at me with desperate eyes. There's a back staircase that leads to the kitchen. Go out through the garden and don't look back. And whatever you do, don't trust anyone in the family. Not anyone. The doorbell rang again, more insistent this time. I'm not leaving you here alone with them. You have to. You're the only one who can stop them now. Dorothy pressed something cold and metallic into my hand, an old-fashioned key. This opens a safety deposit box at First National Bank, box 472. Henry left more evidence there, things that will prove everything. Footsteps were moving around the outside of the house now, looking for another way in. Go, Dorothy whispered urgently. Go now. I ran toward the back of the house, clutching the notebook and key, as the sound of breaking glass echoed from the front room. Behind me, I heard Dorothy's voice, trying to sound calm and welcoming. Thomas, Margaret, what a lovely surprise. Come in, come in. I was just making tea. Then, I was through the kitchen door, and running through the overgrown garden, branches tearing at my clothes as I fled toward the woods beyond. I didn't look back, even when I heard Dorothy scream. I made it to my car, and drove away from Dorothy's house with my heart hammering against my ribs. In my rearview mirror, I could see my father and Margaret's sedan still in the driveway, and I forced myself not to think about what might be happening to my great-aunt inside that dark Victorian house. The safety deposit box key burned in my palm like a brand. Whatever my grandfather had hidden at First National Bank, it was important enough that Dorothy had risked her life to give it to me. But first, I needed somewhere safe to examine her notebook. I drove to a 24-hour diner on the interstate, ordered coffee I didn't want, and spread Dorothy's research across a corner booth. Her handwriting was meticulous, her documentation thorough. Name after name, date after date, method after method. 5 decades of murder disguised as misfortune. The most chilling section was labeled Recent Activity. Dorothy had documented 3 suspicious deaths in the past 18 months, all people who'd had financial or legal conflicts with Fletcher family members. A business partner who'd discovered my father's tax evasion, a neighbor who'd threatened to sue Margaret over a property dispute, a former employee who'd accused Uncle Frank of workplace harassment. All 3 had died of apparent natural causes within weeks of their conflicts becoming public. My phone rang, making me jump. Margaret's name appeared on the caller ID. I let it go to voicemail, then listened to the message with growing dread. Naomi, sweetheart, we just left Aunt Dorothy's house. She's had some kind of accident. Fell down the stairs, I think. We've called an ambulance, but it looks serious. Please call me back as soon as you get this. We're all very worried about you. The lie was delivered with perfect emotional manipulation. Concern, urgency, just the right amount of grief. If I hadn't been running from them an hour ago, I might have believed it. I called the hospital instead. Dorothy Fletcher had been admitted to the ICU with severe head trauma, the result of what appeared to be a fall. She was unconscious and not expected to survive. They'd silenced her. My elderly great-aunt, who'd lived peacefully in her Victorian house for decades, had become a threat to be eliminated. I was next. My phone rang again. This time it was my father. I answered, trying to keep my voice steady. Naomi, thank God. Where are you? I'm driving home from my work trip. Why? There's been an accident. Aunt Dorothy fell down her stairs this morning. She's in critical condition. His voice carried just the right note of family tragedy. The doctors don't think she's going to make it. Oh no, how did it happen? We're not sure. Margaret and I went to visit her this morning. She'd called yesterday asking about old family photographs. When we got there, we found her at the bottom of the staircase. She must have tripped carrying something heavy. The detail about photographs made my stomach clench. They knew Dorothy had been investigating, knew she'd been sharing information with me. Should I come to the hospital? Actually, yes. The whole family is gathering. We need to stick together during times like this. There was something in my father's tone that sounded less like comfort and more like a threat. Where are you now? I could come pick you up. That's okay. I'll drive myself. Naomi, are you sure you're all right? You sound different. Just tired from traveling. Well, be careful driving. We've lost too many family members lately. I'd hate for anything to happen to you too. The words sent ice through my veins. After I hung up, I sat in the diner booth trying to decide what to do next. The smart thing would be to drive straight to the police, hand over Dorothy's notebook and the photograph, and let them sort out the truth. But I needed more proof. Dorothy's research was comprehensive, but it was still mostly circumstantial. Without concrete evidence linking my father or Margaret to specific murders, the police might dismiss it as the paranoid delusions of an elderly woman. I needed to get into that safety deposit box. First National Bank was in the downtown business district, a solid brick building that had been serving the community for over a century. The safety deposit box area was in the basement, accessible only with proper identification and the right key. Box 472 was larger than I'd expected, big enough to hold several file folders, and what looked like a small metal container. I carried everything to the private viewing room and locked the door behind me. The first folder contained photocopies of insurance documents dating back to 1958. Policies taken out on people who later died under suspicious circumstances, all with Fletcher family members as beneficiaries. The amounts were staggering. Over $4 million in payouts over 5 decades. The second folder held bank statements showing regular deposits into accounts controlled by my father, Margaret, and Uncle Marcus. The timing of the deposits corresponded exactly with the insurance payouts from the suspicious deaths, but it was the contents of the metal container that made my hands shake. Inside were dozens of photographs, clearly taken with telephoto lenses from concealed positions. They showed my family members at various times and locations over the years, but always in connection with the people who later died mysteriously. My father meeting with a business partner 3 days before the man's fatal car accident. Margaret visiting an elderly neighbor 2 weeks before the woman's house fire. Uncle Marcus having dinner with a former employee just days before the man's drowning. At the bottom of the container was a single cassette tape labeled, "Insurance. Play only if something happens to me." I found an old portable player in my car and drove to an empty parking lot to listen to my grandfather's final message. His voice was weak but determined. "If you're hearing this, Naomi, then I'm dead, and you're the only one left who can stop them. The Fletcher family has been committing murder for profit for 50 years, and I was part of it in the beginning." My grandfather's confession was like a knife to the heart. It started in 1958 when I was desperate for money. Thomas was in college, Margaret needed medical treatment we couldn't afford, and I was facing bankruptcy. A man approached me with a proposition: stage an accident for someone who was already dying, collect the life insurance, split the proceeds. It seemed victimless at the time, the rationalization of a desperate man who'd made a terrible choice. But it didn't stop there. Once I'd crossed that line, it became easier to cross it again, and again. Over the years, the victims became less sympathetic: business rivals, nosy neighbors, anyone who threatened the family's financial security. Thomas joined the operation when he was 25 and facing his own money problems. Margaret became involved after her marriage fell apart, and she needed funds for the divorce. We told ourselves we were protecting the family, doing what was necessary to survive. But Emma Hartwell changed everything. She was an innocent child who overheard things she shouldn't have heard. When she disappeared, I knew we'd gone too far. I tried to stop the killings, to get out of the business. That's when I discovered the truth. Thomas and Margaret didn't want to stop. They'd developed a taste for the power, for the money, for the control over life and death. When I threatened to confess everything to the police, they made it clear that I'd become a liability. So, I've been living in fear for the past 2 years, knowing that my own children are planning my murder. I've documented everything, gathered all the evidence I could, and left it for you because you're the only family member who was never part of the operation. But Naomi, you need to understand. They will kill you too if they think you know the truth. Don't confront them directly. Don't trust anyone in the family. Take this evidence to the FBI and let them handle it. The tape ended with my grandfather's labored breathing and a whispered, "I'm sorry for all of it, for everything." I sat in my car, staring at the photographs and documents spread across my passenger seat. My father and aunt weren't just killers. They were serial killers who'd been operating for decades, using family connections and carefully staged accidents to eliminate anyone who threatened their criminal enterprise. And now they knew I'd discovered their secret. My phone buzzed with a text message from Margaret. "Family meeting at my house tonight, 7 p.m. Everyone will be there. Don't disappoint us, Naomi." The message felt like a death sentence, but as I looked at the evidence my grandfather had risked everything to preserve, I realized I had 2 choices: run and let the killing continue, or find a way to stop them once and for all. Emma Hartwell deserved justice. Dorothy deserved justice. All the victims deserved justice. And maybe, if I was very careful and very lucky, I could give it to them. Instead of going to Margaret's house, I drove back to Lake Minnetonka. I needed to understand exactly what had happened to Emma Hartwell before I could figure out how to stop the people who'd killed her. The lake house looked different in the late afternoon light, older, more weathered. I parked across the street and studied the building where my family had vacationed that terrible summer of 1975. According to Emma's diary, she'd overheard the murder plot in the basement. According to my grandfather's evidence, that plot had been carried out 3 days later. I needed to see that basement. The current owners were an elderly couple named Patterson, who'd bought the house in 1982. When I knocked on their door and explained that I was researching my family history, they were happy to let me look around. "Oh yes, we know about the girl who disappeared," Mrs. Patterson said as she led me through the familiar rooms. "Terrible tragedy. The police searched this place top to bottom back then. Did they find anything? Not that we ever heard about, though there were some strange things about the house when we bought it." She opened a door I remembered from the photograph's background. The basement, for instance. Previous owners had poured a new concrete floor just a few years before we purchased. Seemed odd, since the old floor had been perfectly fine according to the neighbors. My blood chilled. A new concrete floor, poured sometime after Emma's disappearance. The perfect place to hide a body. Could I see the basement? Mrs. Patterson led me down narrow wooden stairs to a finished basement with concrete floors and paneled walls. It looked innocent enough, just another family room with a pool table and some storage areas. but as I stood there, I could almost hear Emma's frightened voice describing the conversation she'd overheard between Mrs. Fletcher and the young man planning David Morrison's murder. "Mrs. Patterson, you mentioned the concrete was new when you bought the house. Do you remember exactly when it was poured?" "Oh, let me think. The neighbors said it was done in late 1975 or early 1976. Emergency repair work, supposedly. Something about water damage from a broken pipe. Late 1975, just months after Emma had vanished. Was there really water damage? That's the odd thing. We never found any evidence of pipe problems or water damage. The plumbing was all original and in excellent condition." Mrs. Patterson frowned. "Always seemed strange to us that someone would go to the expense of replacing a perfectly good basement floor, unless they were hiding evidence underneath it." I thanked the Pattersons and drove back to Minneapolis as darkness fell. The FBI field office was in a downtown federal building, and I spent 20 minutes in the lobby trying to work up the courage to go upstairs and turn in my family, because that's what I was doing, destroying my father, my aunt, my uncle, everyone I'd grown up loving and trusting. Even if they were killers, they were still the people who'd raised me, who'd been at every birthday and Christmas and graduation. But then I thought about Emma Hartwell, 16 years old and terrified, writing in her diary about the murder plot she'd overheard. I thought about Dorothy, lying unconscious in the hospital with a fractured skull. I thought about all the innocent people who'd died over 5 decades, so my family could profit from their deaths. Agent Rebecca Santos was the duty officer when I finally made it upstairs. She was a serious woman in her 40s who listened without interruption as I laid out everything I'd discovered. The photograph, Dorothy's research, my grandfather's confession, the evidence from the safety deposit box. "This is a lot of information to process," Agent Santos said when I finished. "You're alleging that your family has been committing murder for profit for over 50 years. I know how it sounds. It sounds like the biggest serial murder case in Minnesota history." She studied the photographs and documents I'd spread across her desk. "If even half of this is accurate, we're talking about dozens of victims and millions in insurance fraud. What happens next? We'll need to verify everything, starting with forensic examination of the evidence you've provided. The photographs and audio recording will need to be authenticated, the financial records cross-referenced with the suspicious deaths, witness statements taken from anyone who might have information about the crimes." Agent Santos paused, studying my face carefully. "But I have to ask, Miss Fletcher, why come forward now? If your family has been doing this for decades, why wait until after your grandfather's death to report it?" "Because I didn't know until he left me that photograph, and because I think they're getting ready to kill again." "Who's the target?" "Me. I think they're planning to eliminate me tonight." Agent Santos leaned forward, suddenly more focused. "Explain." I told her about the family meeting at Margaret's house, about Dorothy's accident, about the phone calls and text messages that felt more like threats than family concern. By the time I finished, Agent Santos was making notes and checking her watch. "It's 6:30 now. If this meeting is at 7 p.m., we don't have much time." She picked up her phone. "I'm calling for backup units and a surveillance team. We'll monitor the situation and move in if there's any indication you're in immediate danger." "You want me to go to the meeting?" "With proper protection, yes. If we can get them talking about their crimes, recorded on surveillance equipment, it would provide the concrete evidence we need for prosecution." Agent Santos met my eyes. "But I won't lie to you, Miss Fletcher. If your family really is responsible for all these deaths, attending this meeting puts you in serious danger. They're going to kill me anyway if they think I know the truth. At least this way, their crimes might finally be exposed." Agent Santos fitted me with a wire, a tiny microphone and transmitter hidden under my shirt, and gave me a panic button disguised as a car key fob. If I pressed it, FBI agents would storm Margaret's house within 60 seconds. "Remember," she said as I prepared to leave, "you're not trying to be a hero. You're gathering evidence. Ask questions that will get them talking about specific crimes, but don't push so hard that they become suspicious. What if they search me for wires? Then you press the panic button immediately. Don't wait. Don't try to talk your way out of it. These people have killed before, and they won't hesitate to kill again." As I drove toward Margaret's house, I thought about Emma Hartwell walking to the lake shore 47 years ago, probably believing she was safe with people she considered family. She'd trusted them, and that trust had cost her life. I wasn't going to make the same mistake. Margaret's house was blazing with lights when I arrived, and I could see several cars in the driveway. The entire family was there, just as she'd promised. My father's car, Uncle Marcus's truck, Uncle Frank's sedan, and a few others I didn't immediately recognize. A family meeting, or a family execution. I sat in my car for a moment, touching the panic button in my pocket, knowing that FBI agents were watching from concealed positions around the neighborhood. Then I walked up to the front door and rang the bell. Margaret answered with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Naomi, sweetheart. So glad you could make it. Everyone's been worried about you." As I stepped into the house, I could hear voices from the living room, familiar voices of aunts and uncles and cousins I'd known my entire life. But now those voices sounded different to me, knowing what I knew about their capacity for violence. "Come on," Margaret said, taking my arm with a grip that was just a little too tight. "Let's join the family." The living room was full of Fletcher relatives, all watching me with expressions I couldn't quite read. My father stood by the fireplace, his face grave. Uncle Marcus sat in his usual chair, but his hands were clenched into fists. Uncle Frank was by the window, positioned where he could see anyone approaching the house. They knew, somehow. They all knew I'd discovered their secret. Margaret closed the living room door behind us and turned to face me. "Now then, Naomi," she said in a voice like poisoned honey, "let's talk about what you found in Aunt Dorothy's house." The family meeting wasn't what I'd expected. Instead of the warm, chaotic gathering I remembered from childhood, this felt like a tribunal. Everyone sat in carefully positioned chairs, forming a semicircle around where I stood, their faces displaying emotions ranging from disappointment to outright hostility. "Sit down, Naomi," my father said, gesturing to a single chair that had been placed in the center of the room. "We need to have a serious conversation." I remained standing, my hand close to the panic button in my pocket. "About what?" "About your recent activities," Margaret said, settling into her chair with the air of someone conducting a business meeting. "Your trips to Minnesota, your visits with elderly family members, your interest in old photographs and family history." "I don't know what you mean." "Please don't insult our intelligence." Uncle Marcus spoke for the first time, his voice carrying none of the warmth I'd grown up with. "We know you've been investigating Emma Hartwell's disappearance. We know you've been asking questions about deaths in the family going back decades." Uncle Frank leaned forward from his position by the window. "More importantly, we know you've been talking to people outside the family about private Fletcher business." The accusations hung in the air like smoke. I could feel the wire taped under my shirt, could imagine Agent Santos and her team listening to every word from their surveillance van. "I was just curious about family history," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Grandpa Henry left me an old photograph and I wanted to understand what it meant." "What photograph?" My father's question was sharp, urgent. I pulled the picture from my purse, the one that had started everything. "This one, from Lake Minnetonka in 1975. The reaction was immediate and electric. Every person in the room tensed, and I saw Uncle Marcus and Margaret exchange a look that could have cut glass. "Where did you find this?" Margaret demanded. "I told you, Grandpa left it to me," along with a note saying, "The killer is in this photo." The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear the air conditioning humming, a clock ticking somewhere in the kitchen, the distant sound of traffic. But no one in the room spoke for what felt like an eternity. Finally, my father cleared his throat. "Naomi, your grandfather was a sick man in his final months. The medication he was taking sometimes caused confusion, paranoid delusions. Whatever he told you about killers and family secrets, it wasn't real." "Then why are you all so nervous?" "Because," Margaret said quietly, "we've been trying to protect you from a very painful truth about your grandfather." "What truth?" Uncle Marcus stood up and began pacing, a gesture that would have seemed normal in any other context but now felt threatening. "Henry Fletcher was not the man you thought he was, Naomi. He was troubled, deeply troubled." "Troubled how?" "He killed people." My father's words hit the room like a bomb, starting back in the 1950s, continuing for decades. Henry was a serial killer who used the family as cover for his crimes. I stared at him, momentarily speechless. This wasn't what I'd expected them to say. "That's impossible." "Is it?" Margaret pulled out a folder I hadn't noticed before. "We've been investigating Henry's activities for years, ever since we started noticing patterns in the deaths of people who'd had conflicts with him." She spread photographs across the coffee table. Some I recognized from Dorothy's research, others that were new to me. All showed my grandfather in proximity to people who later died under suspicious circumstances. "We think Henry killed at least 20 people over the course of his lifetime," Uncle Frank said from his position by the window. "Maybe more. He was very careful, very patient, and very good at making murder look like accident or natural causes. But the insurance money was how he funded his activities and took care of the family," my father interrupted. "Henry felt guilty about the danger his crimes put us in, so he made sure we benefited financially from his work." I looked around the room at their faces, trying to detect deception, but they all looked genuinely sad, as if they were sharing a painful family secret rather than covering up their own crimes. "What about Emma Hartwell, Henry's youngest victim?" Margaret said softly. "Emma overheard him planning another murder and threatened to go to the police. He couldn't let that happen." "And David Morrison, the private investigator who disappeared in 1974? Henry killed him too." Morrison was getting close to the truth about the pattern of deaths. Uncle Marcus stopped pacing and looked directly at me. "That's why your grandfather left you that photograph, Naomi. He was dying, his conscience was bothering him, and he wanted someone in the family to know the truth about what he'd done. The story was compelling, logical, and completely at odds with everything I'd discovered in my investigation. But as I looked around the room, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. Everyone was positioned strategically. Uncle Frank by the window where he could watch for outside interference. Margaret near the door to block my exit. Uncle Marcus pacing in a pattern that kept him between me and any potential escape route. My father standing by the fireplace where he could easily reach the poker or other improvised weapons. This wasn't a family intervention. This was a trap. "There's just one problem with your story," I said, trying to buy time while I figured out how to get out of the room alive. "I found Dorothy's research. I found Grandpa's confession. I know the truth about who's really been doing the killing." The pretense dropped from their faces like masks falling away. Margaret's expression turned cold and calculating. Uncle Marcus stopped pacing and moved closer to where I stood. My father's hand moved toward the fireplace tools. "What exactly do you think you know?" Margaret asked. "I know that you and Dad have been killing people for profit for decades. I know that Uncle Marcus helped. I know that you murdered Emma Hartwell because she overheard you planning David Morrison's death." "Prove it," my father said quietly. "I already have. I've given everything to the FBI. Dorothy's research, Grandpa's evidence, the financial records, all of it. They're investigating the insurance claims, the suspicious deaths, the pattern of murders going back 50 years. The silence that followed was different from before, charged with danger and desperation." "That's unfortunate," Margaret said finally, "because it means we're going to have to accelerate our timeline." "What timeline?" "The timeline for your accident, dear." Margaret's smile was genuinely chilling. "We'd hoped to wait a few months, let things settle down after Henry's death. But if you've already gone to the authorities, we don't have that luxury." Uncle Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out a syringe filled with clear liquid. "This will be quick, Naomi, and painless, just like it was for Dorothy." I pressed the panic button. Nothing happened. Margaret noticed my movement and laughed. "Looking for this?" She held up the wire I'd been wearing, torn free from where it had been taped to my skin. "Uncle Frank has quite a bit of experience with surveillance equipment from his military days. He spotted your wire the moment you walked in the door. I was trapped in a room full of killers, with no way to call for help and no way to escape. But I wasn't going to go quietly into the dark like Emma Hartwell had." "You're not going to get away with this," I said, backing toward the window. "The FBI knows I'm here. They're watching the house." "Actually, they're not." Uncle Frank spoke from his position by the window. "I checked the surrounding area thoroughly before you arrived. No surveillance teams, no backup units. You came here alone. Then they'll know something's wrong when I don't report back. Will they?" Margaret tilted her head thoughtfully. "Or will they assume that you had second thoughts about betraying your family and decided to disappear rather than testify against us?" Uncle Marcus moved closer with the syringe. "It's a shame it has to end this way, Naomi. We really did love you, but family loyalty only goes so far." As he reached for my arm, I realized that everything I'd believed about the FBI surveillance was wrong. Agent Santos hadn't been trying to protect me. She'd been setting me up to be eliminated by my own family. But that meant someone else had been pulling the strings all along. Someone who'd wanted me to discover the truth about the Fletcher family murders, but who never intended for that truth to become public. Someone who'd been planning this moment from the very beginning. As Uncle Marcus approached with the syringe, I had a sudden, horrible realization about everything that had happened since my grandfather's funeral. "Wait," I said, putting up my hands to stop him. "There's something wrong with all of this. Something that doesn't make sense." "What are you talking about?" Margaret demanded. "The timing, the evidence, the way everything unfolded." I looked around the room at my family members, seeing them with new eyes. "Someone wanted me to discover your crimes. Someone set this entire investigation in motion." "You're stalling," my father said. "Marcus, just give her the injection." "No, listen to me," I said urgently. "Think about it logically. Why would Grandpa Henry leave me that photograph with a note about killers if he was the killer himself? Why would he confess to crimes on tape and then leave evidence that would incriminate you? Why would he want the truth to come out at all?" Uncle Marcus paused, the syringe halfway to my arm, because he was dying and felt guilty, or because he was trying to expose the real killer, someone who'd been framing him for decades. I looked directly at Margaret. Someone who'd been very carefully documenting his supposed crimes and building a case against him while committing the murders herself. Margaret's face went very still. "That's absurd." "Is it? You organized every family gathering for 50 years. You knew everyone's schedules, their financial problems, their personal conflicts. You had access to everyone's medical information through your work at the insurance company. You could arrange accidents, forge documents, manipulate investigations." "Naomi, you're being ridiculous," my father said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now. "And you," I turned to him, "you benefited from the insurance payouts, but you never actually planned any of the murders, did you?" Margaret told you about windfalls after they'd already happened. She made you complicit after the fact, but you were never the mastermind. The room had gone very quiet. Uncle Marcus was still holding the syringe, but he was looking at Margaret with new suspicion. What about Emma Hartwell? Uncle Frank asked from his position by the window. What really happened to her? Emma overheard Margaret planning David Morrison's murder, but she wasn't talking to a young man in the basement. She was talking to someone on the phone. The young man she saw was probably Marcus, but he wasn't part of the conversation. He was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. I could see the doubt spreading through the room like a virus. These people had been following Margaret's lead for decades, trusting her version of events, never questioning why she always seemed to know so much about the family's finances and legal problems. Margaret killed Emma 3 days later, then convinced everyone that the girl had run away. She probably buried her body under the basement floor when she had the concrete poured in late 1975. This is insane, Margaret said, but her voice lacked conviction. Henry confessed to everything on that tape. No, he confessed to being part of something that started in the 1950s, but he never said he was the one planning the murders. I pulled out my phone and found the audio file I'd recorded. Listened to his exact words. My grandfather's voice filled the room. It started in 1958 when I was desperate for money. A man approached me with a proposition. Stage an accident for someone who was already dying, collect the life insurance, split the proceeds. A man approached him, I emphasized. Henry wasn't the originator of the scheme. He was recruited by someone else. Thomas joined the operation when he was 25 and facing his own money problems. Margaret became involved after her marriage fell apart, and she needed funds for the divorce. Margaret became involved, I repeated. Not I recruited Margaret. He's describing her as joining something that already existed, something she eventually took control of. Oh, the pieces were falling into place with horrible clarity. Margaret had been the real architect of the Fletcher family murders, but she'd been careful to make it look like Henry was the mastermind. When Henry started getting suspicious in his final months, she'd fed him false information and manipulated him into making a confession that would exonerate her while implicating himself. You killed your own father, I said, looking at Margaret with a mixture of horror and disgust. You poisoned him when he started asking too many questions about the real pattern of murders. Margaret's mask finally slipped completely. The warm, maternal aunt I'd known my entire life vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating and utterly without remorse. Henry was becoming a liability, she said simply. He was going to ruin everything with his guilty conscience and his need to confess. 50 years of careful planning, and he wanted to throw it all away because he felt bad about some girl who'd been dead for decades. The admission hung in the air like a death sentence. Even Uncle Marcus stepped back from her, the syringe forgotten in his hand. Jesus, Margaret, my father whispered. What have you done? What I've always done. Protected this family, ensured our financial security, eliminated threats to our way of life. Margaret's voice was matter of fact, as if she were discussing grocery shopping. The people who died were all problems, Thomas. They would have destroyed us if they'd been allowed to live. But Emma was just a child. Emma was a witness who could have sent us all to prison, just like Naomi is now. Margaret looked at me with cold calculation. The only difference is that this time, there won't be any evidence left behind. No photographs, no confessions, no financial records. Just a tragic accident involving a young woman who'd been struggling with depression since her grandfather's death. She took the syringe from Uncle Marcus's hand. A suicide, I think. Much more believable than another accident so soon after Dorothy's fall. You're not going to get away with this, I said, but I could hear the desperation in my own voice. Actually, I am, because unlike Henry, I don't suffer from inconvenient attacks of conscience. Margaret moved toward me with the calm efficiency of someone who'd done this many times before. I've been planning for this possibility ever since Henry started asking questions. Your death will close the last loose end, and the Fletcher family murders will remain a secret forever. But as Margaret raised the syringe, Uncle Frank suddenly spoke from his position by the window. Actually, Margaret, I don't think they will. She turned toward him, confused. What are you talking about? I'm talking about the FBI surveillance team that's been watching this house for the past hour. The same team that's been recording every word of your confession through the microphone Naomi's been wearing. Margaret spun back toward me, her face twisting with rage. But we removed the wire. You removed a wire, Uncle Frank corrected. But you didn't find the backup transmitter I planted in her purse when she first arrived. The front door exploded inward as FBI agents swarmed the house, weapons drawn, shouting commands for everyone to get on the ground. In the chaos that followed, I saw Margaret try to use the syringe on herself rather than face capture, but Agent Santos tackled her before she could depress the plunger. As the handcuffs clicked around Margaret's wrists, she looked at me with pure hatred. You have no idea what you've done, Naomi. No idea how much this family needed that money to survive. Then you should have gotten jobs instead of committing murder, I replied. Later, As I gave my statement to Agent Santos, I learned the truth about how the investigation had really unfolded. Uncle Frank, whose military background included intelligence work, had been suspicious of Margaret for years. When my grandfather died, Frank had reached out to the FBI with his own evidence and suspicions. The entire evening had been a carefully orchestrated sting operation, with Frank playing the role of loyal family member while actually working with federal agents to gather evidence and protect me from Margaret's final, desperate attempt to cover her tracks. "Your aunt is going to prison for the rest of her life," Agent Santos told me, "along with your father and Uncle Marcus as accessories to some of the murders." "What about the bodies? Emma Hartwell and the others?" "We'll be excavating the basement of that Lake Minnetonka house tomorrow, and several other locations where Margaret might have disposed of victims over the years." As I finally went home that night, I thought about my grandfather's final message and the photograph that had started everything. He'd been trying to expose Margaret all along, but he'd had to be careful about how he did it. He couldn't directly accuse his own daughter without proof, so he'd set up a puzzle that would lead me to the truth while protecting me as much as possible. The killer really had been in that photograph. She'd been smiling at the camera just like everyone else, hiding her true nature behind the mask of a loving family member. But the picture hadn't lied. If you knew how to look at it properly, you could see the truth in Margaret's eyes, the cold calculation of someone who viewed other human beings as problems to be solved rather than lives to be cherished. Emma Hartwell would finally get justice, and I would finally understand that sometimes the greatest monsters are the ones who tuck you in at night and tell you they love you. 3 months after Margaret's arrest, I stood at the edge of Lake Minnetonka, watching FBI forensics teams carefully excavate the basement of the old rental house. They'd found Emma Hartwell's remains exactly where I'd suspected they would be, buried beneath the concrete floor that had been poured in late 1975. Agent Santos approached me carrying a small evidence bag. "We found this with the remains," she said gently. "Emma's diary, the one you photographed. It was wrapped in plastic, buried with her body." I looked at the water-damaged book that had contained a frightened 16-year-old's final thoughts. Why would Margaret keep it? Trophy, maybe? Or insurance? Something to hold over the heads of anyone who might get suspicious. Santos paused, studying the lake where Emma had supposedly gone for her final walk. "Your aunt was methodical about documenting her crimes, even when that documentation could incriminate her. Over the past 3 months, the FBI had uncovered the full scope of Margaret Fletcher's 47-year killing spree. 23 victims, including Emma and my grandfather, millions in insurance fraud, a network of forged documents, bribed officials, and staged accidents that stretched across multiple states. Margaret had confessed to everything, but without remorse. Even in custody, she maintained that she'd been protecting her family's financial interests and that her victims had brought it on themselves by threatening Fletcher family security. My father and Uncle Marcus were facing charges as accessories after the fact. Both claimed they'd believed Henry was the mastermind and had been too afraid of him to go to the authorities. The evidence suggested this was largely true. Margaret had been careful to keep them complicit but ignorant, using them for alibis and financial transactions, while maintaining sole control over the planning and execution of murders. Uncle Frank had been instrumental in the investigation, providing decades of secretly gathered evidence and testimony that helped prosecutors build an airtight case. He'd suspected Margaret since the early 1980s, but had never been able to prove anything until my grandfather's death provided the opening he'd been waiting for. "There's something else," Agent Santos said, handing me a second evidence bag. This one contained a letter, handwritten in Emma's careful script. She'd written this to her parents back in Chicago. It was never mailed. The letter was dated July 19, 1975, the day after Emma's final diary entry. "Dear Mom and Dad, I know you didn't want me to come to Minnesota for the summer, but I'm so glad Great Aunt Martha invited me. It's been wonderful here, and I've learned so much about our family history, but something terrible happened yesterday, and I don't know what to do about it. I overheard some people planning to hurt someone, planning to kill someone, and I'm scared they know I was listening. I tried to tell Great Aunt Martha, but she thinks I'm being dramatic. Maybe I am. Maybe I misunderstood what I heard, but I keep thinking about that man they were talking about, David, and how they seemed so certain he needed to die. If something happens to me, I want you to know that I love you both very much. I'm going to try to call the police tomorrow, but I wanted to write this down first in case I don't get the chance. I hope I'm wrong about everything. I hope this letter never gets sent, because it all turns out to be a misunderstanding. But if you're reading this, then something bad has happened, and you should know that the Fletcher family isn't what they seem to be. Love always, Emma." The letter had been hidden in Emma's bedroom at Martha Hartwell's house, probably written in the hours before Margaret lured her to her death by the lake. It was a final testament from a brave girl who'd tried to do the right thing, even though she knew it might cost her life. "The trial starts next month," Agent Santos said. Will you be ready to testify? Yes, Emma deserves to have her story told. I'd spent the past 3 months in therapy, trying to process the revelation that my beloved aunt had been a serial killer and that my entire family structure had been built on lies and murder. Some days were harder than others, but I was slowly rebuilding my sense of identity and my understanding of love and loyalty. The hardest part was accepting that Margaret really had loved me, in her own twisted way. She'd been a devoted aunt who'd attended every school play and birthday party, who'd taught me to cook and helped me through my first heartbreak. The capacity for genuine affection and the capacity for remorseless murder had coexisted in the same person, and that contradiction would probably haunt me forever. But I'd also learned something important. The rest of my family, the ones who weren't killers, were struggling with the same contradictions. We'd all loved Margaret while being completely unaware of her true nature. That didn't make us guilty of her crimes, but it did make us victims of her deception. Uncle Frank and I had grown closer during the investigation. He'd become a sort of surrogate father figure, helping me navigate the legal proceedings and the media attention that followed Margaret's arrest. He'd also helped me understand that my grandfather's final actions had been motivated by love, not guilt. Henry knew he was dying, Frank told me one evening as we sat in his living room going through family photos. He also knew that Margaret was planning something involving you. He'd overheard phone conversations, seen financial documents that suggested you were being set up as her next victim. Why didn't he just go to the police himself? Because he had no concrete proof, and because he was afraid Margaret would kill you immediately if she realized he was onto her. So he created that elaborate puzzle with the photograph and the safety deposit box, hoping you'd be smart enough to solve it and careful enough to survive the process. I thought about my grandfather's final gift. Not just the evidence that exposed Margaret, but the faith he'd shown in my ability to handle the truth and seek justice for Emma Hartwell. The trial was a media sensation, of course. The story had everything journalists loved: family secrets, decades of deception, a serial killer hiding in plain sight. But I tried to keep Emma at the center of my testimony, remembering that she was the real victim whose story needed to be told. Margaret was sentenced to life in prison without possibility of parole. She showed no emotion when the verdict was read, maintaining her cold composure to the end. My father received 15 years for accessory charges, and Uncle Marcus got 12 years for his lesser role in the conspiracy. After the trial, I moved to Portland to start over. I'd inherited a substantial amount of money, not from the insurance fraud, which had been seized by the government, but from legitimate family assets that had been held in trust. I used some of it to establish a foundation in Emma Hartwell's memory, dedicated to investigating cold cases involving missing teenagers. 1 year after Margaret's conviction, I returned to Lake Minnetonka for the memorial service we held for Emma and the other victims. Martha Hartwell had died 6 months earlier, but her daughter Carol was there, along with family members of several other victims who'd finally gotten answers about their loved ones' disappearances. We placed a marker by the lake shore where Emma had supposedly gone for her final walk. It read, Emma Marie Hartwell, 1959-1975, beloved daughter and niece. She died seeking truth and justice. As the sun set over the lake, I thought about the photograph that had started everything. My family members smiling at the camera, unaware that one of them was a killer. I'd learned that evil could wear a familiar face, that monsters could be the people who claim to love you most. But I'd also learned that truth has a way of surfacing eventually, no matter how deeply it's buried. Emma Hartwell's voice had been silenced for 47 years, but it had finally been heard. And sometimes, that has to be enough. Standing by the lake where a 16-year-old girl had died, trying to save a stranger's life, I made my own promise, to listen to the voices of the victims, to seek truth even when it was painful, and to remember that justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied. Emma's story was finally over, but her legacy of courage and moral conviction would continue in the foundation that bore her name, and in the cold cases that would be solved because of her example. The killer had been in the photograph all along, but so had the people who truly loved their family enough to seek justice, even when that justice came at a terrible personal cost. And in the end, love, real love, honest love, had won.